Hi, everyone. I'll wrap up this series on intermediaries by looking at when you actually need updated documentation, because this is where things can often drift in practice. Starting with the IMY itself, this is one of the areas where intermediaries work a bit different from beneficial ownership forms. Unlike a W8BEN or a W8BEN-E, which both follow the standard rule of expiring at the end of the third calendar year after they're signed, W8 IMY is generally valid indefinitely. So rather than working on a fixed expiry date, it remains valid until there's a relevant change in circumstance or the information on the form is just no longer correct. But that doesn't mean your documentation just sits there unchanged. The indefinite validity only applies to the form itself. It doesn't extend to the withholding statement or any underlying documentation, which is where most of the real movement happens. And that distinction is important because it's easy to focus on whether the form has expired and miss whether it's still usable. Then separately, you've got the withholding statements. These don't really work on a fixed expiry in the same way either. They're tied to what's actually happening underneath the intermediary. If the underlying investor base changes, if allocations change, if documentation changes, then the withholding statement should be updated. And in theory, that can mean the withholding statement is being updated constantly to reflect those changes. But in reality, withholding statements will often move out of sync with what's still underneath the intermediary over time. And that creates a real risk. If the withholding statement no longer reflects the underlying investor's allocations or documentation, then the withholding being applied can end up being based on information that isn't actually correct anymore. So at that point, it's not just an operational issue, the tax outcome itself could be wrong. At the same time, keeping withholding statements perfectly up to date isn't easy at all times. There is an operational burden on the intermediary to track changes continuously and on the withholding agent to process and validate frequent updates. So in practice, what you tend to see is a more structured approach where intermediaries provide updated withholding statements at defined intervals rather than on every single movement underneath. That can work from a practical perspective, but it's important to note that the responsibility will always sit with the intermediary to keep the full IMY package accurate, including the withholding statement and underlying documentation. And it's not just about following a structured update cycle. If there's a material change that affects the underlying allocations or documentation, the withholding statement needs to be updated to reflect that, even if it falls outside that process. Because if that doesn't happen, withholding being applied may not reflect the underlying position. That's not always obvious at the point you're making the payment. And that's really the key point of this whole series. It's not just about labels like QI and NQI, or whether a form is technically in date. It's about whether the full chain of documentation still supports how the payment is being made and reported today. So while the IMY might sit there for years, the reality underneath is constantly moving, and your processes need to keep up. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on TAINA Tips.